Have you ever watched queer cowboy films on television and wondered how homosexuality was tolerated in the West? Certainly you would feel somehow bizarre watching films like Brokeback Mountain, Lonesome Cowboys, and the like. But history books would tell you that despite how out of place it might be, love between the same gender exists even in an era where charisma and masculinity were dominant. In fact, the term "it ain't gay, cowboy, it's just the Wild West" is a famous line that Wild West commoners used to say. You see, very few people in the world consider Western history to be queer. However, the West has always been queer. From outspoken militant lesbians forging their own path to courageous trans people seeking freedom to homosexual cowboys, simply looking for love. Believe it or not, queer stories are buried and hidden beneath the dunes and barrens of the West, waiting to be recalled. And in this video, we will tackle a few of these stories in a quest to remember the Wild West and the cowboys, the geography, history, folklore, and culture of the forward wave of American expansion in mainland North America, which started with European colonial settlements in the early 17th century and ended with the admission of the last few contiguous Western territories as states in 1912, are referred to as the American frontier, also known as the Old West or the Wild West. As a result, folklore, historical incidents, and tales of the American frontier have been so ingrained in American society that the Old West, and notably the Western genre of media, has emerged as one of the pivotal eras in the formation of American identity. According to historian Frederick Jackson Turner, several historians have recently abandoned the conventional conception of the West as a frontier or a meeting point between civilization and savagery. They have started to describe the West as a place where numerous groups fought for control of land, money, and cultural dominance. So, as you can imagine, there were many ways to romanticize and promote the westward movement of people from the East Coast to the West before the cowboy ever became an American icon. People who migrated west were not necessarily doing so for family reasons. Rather, they were doing so because they had run out of options, and the vast mining, cattle, and railroad industries that were flourishing in the West were the only places they had left to go. The cowboy, frequently portrayed in popular culture as a glamorous or heroic figure, came to be seen as the embodiment of the West in the late 19th century. However, the stereotype of the brave white cowboy is untrue. Spanish vaqueros, who had brought cattle to Mexico centuries before, were the first cowboys. Cowboys of color also rode the range. In addition, the life of a cowboy was anything but glamorous, entailing long, arduous hours of labor, substandard living arrangements, and financial difficulties. Most cowboys weren't these romantic cishead men living a life of horseback freedom, which is exactly the image most East Coast folks grew to believe even at the height of the Old West era. In reality, they were laborers who were frequently black, brown, and indigenous people who are gay and had a history of being in prison, on the run from the law, or being completely rejected by their community due to their sexual orientation. Most importantly, these workers were extremely poor. By the time the 1980s arrived, beef had come to govern the nation and required a huge increase in the labor force to manage. Here, the professional cowboys, also known as cowpunchers, drovers, buckaroos, wranglers, or vaqueros, became a recognized American vocation. Now, let's talk about straight shooters who will surely change the way you see these cowboys' homosexuality in the West. First of all, it must be absolutely clear that current sexuality classifications did not exist during the heyday of the Old West. People's conceptions of sexuality are significantly different from our own now. In essence, sexuality wasn't yet seen as something you were, rather, it was seen as something you did. Therefore, it was common for individuals to be in gay relationships while still considering themselves to be straight if they met other social expectations. Marriage and gender presentation come first. The phrase "confirmed bachelor" is a queer code phrase in part because of this. It was unquestionably regarded as strange for a man to purposefully refuse to get married for the rest of his life, and, well, owing to circumstances, many cowboys ended up as confirmed bachelors. Most male cowboys would spend that much time without ever seeing a lady due to their long-term work commitments that kept them away from any neighboring towns for up to many months. To avoid confrontation, women typically don't work on ranches, and going to a brothel in town puts you at risk of contracting an incurable sexually transmitted disease. Keep in mind that penicillin wasn't yet a thing then, so a lot of people were just being careful. As a result, whether or not they are identified as queer, cowboys frequently team up with one another to vent their sexual frustrations. It was easy for cowboys to avoid rumors because many cowboys never stayed in one place for too long. However, many cowboys also formed incredibly close relationships that were practically marriage-like, spending their entire lives together, starting businesses, and moving from ranch to ranch in tandem. Regardless of sexual orientation, this was a financially wise move to make. When you only make $40 or less per month, you don't make nearly enough to support a wife and children. But if you work with another male partner, you can stay together on the job and eventually earn enough money from both of your jobs to buy and run your own ranch. Queers of the West. Here are some stories of real Old West trans folks. First is Old Nash, a laundress who married a number of soldiers, as recalled by General Custer's wife Elizabeth. Old Nash had attempted to live as a man but had grown bored of it and switched to living as a woman. She rose to prominence in the Fort Lincoln neighborhood and spent 5 years with her last husband, John Noonan. Old Nash was a well-liked village midwife who made pies and frequently inquired, "Are you comfortable?" to expectant mothers. Nobody knew she was trans until she passed away, and on her deathbed, she requested to be buried intact in her own clothes. Unfortunately, her wishes were not honored, and it was revealed that Old Nash was actually a man. Because of the enormous derision directed at her husband, he tragically took his own life. After hearing the news, Elizabeth Custer didn't think any differently of her buddy, Old Nash. "Poor dear, I hope she is finally comfortable," was her last wish after hearing the fiasco. Unfortunately, the happy endings in times like these are the ones that no one knew enough about to be reported on, so the clearest cases of trans people in this period typically come from tragic cases like Old Nash. The same is true for gay people. The tragedies and court cases were the most detailed accounts of LGBT people we have had for centuries. There are times when secret journals and letters mysteriously avoid being burned by family members or ruined by the passage of time. However, this doesn't mean there was no good stories. It's just that most of it are either not recorded or already forgotten. Stigma of queerness. Multiple historians pointed out that the existence of homosexuality threatens a crucial aspect of American sentimental life, including the camaraderie of the baseball diamond and locker room, the good company of the poker game, the fishing trip, and a particular kind of passionless passion that is both gross and delicate, homoerotic in the sense of a boy, and endowed with an innocence above suspicion. The idea of members of their own race functioning outside of white gender norms in the same way as native peoples was repugnant to many colonist settlers. That means queerness has no place in our idealized society when it translates into people's concerns about queer people today. Even though queers and homosexual have always been here, it feels like they don't belong. The issue, though, is that queer spaces frequently embrace white supremacist ideologies and replicate the same power structures inside the community to be accepted and validated by the mainstream. Most frequently, this takes the form of the pervasive racism and misogyny that permeate many white homosexual communities. The gay male fixation on the icon of the cowboy was partially due to internal turmoil. In the rise of the Reagan era, which pushed and popularized rugged, soulless masculinity, gay men, and particularly white gay men, struggled to feel validated in their own masculinity. This era saw the rise in gay subcultures of motorcycle gangs and a return to the turn-of-the-century fixation on outdoorsy muscle men, empowering a new emphasis on straight acting as gay men railed against assumed effeminacy, which in turn alienated feminine or less macho gay men from many spaces. There is no doubt that we still have a long way to go, even though this has significantly improved in the new millennium. Overcoming the stigma. Even though so much historical queerness is covert, there is still a lot of beauty to be found when you're willing to look for it, since it often hides in plain sight. Rodeo cowboys continue to provide rurally underprivileged people with family structures that they might not otherwise have had access to, just as they did in the past. In the end, the Native American community's viewpoints should be taken into consideration while talking about the Old West and its legacy. It is true that many other groups of people were able to start new lives in the Old West, free from the social restrictions of the more traditional cities and the arduous journeys they are left behind. However, acknowledging this fact cannot be achieved at the expense of continuing to erase Native significance and perspectives from Old Western history. And in the end of the day, the West is indeed queer, lively, and full stories worth telling. Gays and transgender people have always had a place in this world, both historically and currently and hopefully. When people seek for the Wild West, they also remember that once in the vast desert where cowboys would roam all day, men fall in love with each other. And that's okay. That's it for today's video. Make sure to give this a like and subscribe to the channel for more.